Welcome to this event in the 2020 Portobello Book Festival. My name is May Shaw and I'm a member of the organising group. The festival is organised annually by a local group of enthusiastic readers and writers in conjunction with and in support of the local public library. Books featured can be found at the Portobello Bookshop. I would like to thank today's contributors for their willingness to participate in this reconfigured festival. Thank you for joining us and we hope you enjoy it.
Peter Ross is a 9-time winner at the Scottish Press Awards and is the celebrated author of such books as Donderlust and The Passion of Harry Bingo. His latest work is a love letter to the kirkyards, cemeteries, boneyards and charnel houses of ancient and modern Britain and beyond. No better place therefore to meet him than Glasgow's famous necropolis, where, exclusively for the Portobello Book Festival, he spoke with me, Alistair Heather. We begin with a reading from A Tomb with a View.
Son of a tutu, a British Nigerian drag queen, is getting on from 7 feet tall, from headdress to heels. Between these poles, she is entirely fabulous, entirely gift of the gabulous, and seemingly entirely at home among the dead. Golden evening light cascaded through the cupola of the Anglican chapel, sparkling on scarlet fingernails, as she lifted her hands towards the dome at the climax of This Is Me, a defiant anthem of self-acceptance from the greatest showman, and sang, I won't let them break me down to dust. I know that there's a place for us. In her company, this graveyard didn't seem so grave. We were in Brompton, a beautiful Victorian cemetery for queerly departed, a tour of those plots in which are buried people who are known or thought to have been gay, lesbian, bisexual, or some shade in between. It was early July, the evening before Pride, when 30,000 Londoners were expected out marching on the streets, and this tour was being conducted in the same spirit of solidarity and celebration. It isn't about outing people posthumously, the guide, Sheldon K. Goodman, had told me earlier. We are their ambassadors, he said. They can now have their life stories told without fear of retribution or ostracisation. In their own lifetimes, they couldn't be fully themselves. Sheldon, who is 32, was wearing heavy black and silver makeup around his eyes. His t-shirt had a drawing of a skull on it. I was curious about how to characterise his thing for cemeteries. Was it a fascination or perhaps an obsession? The word hobby seemed inadequate. An obsession, definitely, he laughed. Graves are just so tantalising. Those basic facts, a name and dates, are the entrance to a wormhole for anyone with a curious mind and a well-charged phone. Start with Google and take it from there. See that big obelisk? He pointed. That's Lionel Monkton. He was a composer and songwriter, and all his stuff is on Spotify for streaming. Probably only 3 people a month listen to it, but I'm one of them. Some of the songs are delightfully of their time. He started to sing one about horse racing from 1909. Back your fancy, come and have a gamble. He's also keen on Sir Montague Fowler, an eminent priest, and always gives his stone a clean whenever he's in Brompton. This sounds weird, but it feels like I know him, he said. It's a shame he died in the 30s. I would love to take him out for a pint.
Thank you for that. So we're joined at this digital Portobello Book Festival by Peter Ross to discuss his new book, Tomb with a View. That was an extract from a particularly fine chapter there. Peter, thanks very much for joining us, first of all, and congratulations on the book. It's going very well. It's proven very popular. One of the words that emerges from it, one of the pieces of vocabulary I've picked up and would describe that person you're talking about there, and perhaps also yourself very much, is Haphophile. Can you tell us about what that means, where it comes from, and what it means to you?
Well, a Haphophile is a lover of graveyards. I assume it comes from the Greek, as so many of these things do. And it's a word that is perhaps pretty unfamiliar to most people, but I think the sentiment and the feeling and the desire will be quite familiar to people, because I think Britain is a nation that loves graveyards. I think we like to wander within these places. And I think there's several reasons for that. I think graveyards are actually very active places in which to walk. It's not a passive experience walking within a graveyard. You come into these places and you're physically walking around, but you're also using your mind and your eyes. You're being stimulated by the beautiful memorials and monuments. And you're also looking at the names and the dates of birth and death, and you're wondering who these people were, how did they live and how did they die, did any of them know each other? So it's a place full of stories, essentially, graveyards.
You do refer to graveyards very wonderfully as a library of stories, in a sense. I mean, we're here in Glasgow's Necropolis, quite a famous landmark, but also a famous visitor attraction. I'm not sure if you're aware, but this place is 4.5 stars out of 5 on TripAdvisor, with 3,500 positive reviews. Do you think that, you mentioned that you think that the folk in Britain have this kind of undiagnosed Haphophile.
Yeah.
You yourself had that from a very young age, grew up in Stirling, is that right?
Yeah, so I grew up in Stirling, and then we moved away, but my grandparents still stayed there. So I used to spend every summer in that graveyard from being quite a young boy. And in those days, it was quite a run-down place, really quite a no-go area. You know, it was, a lot of the tombs were smashed up. It was a real mess. But nevertheless, I was allowed for some reason to go and spend the whole day playing there, either myself or with a wee pal. And we used to go to the little pond, the weird little pond there called the Pithy Mary, and sort of collect tadpoles from there. But then kind of wander out and look at the graves, and some of them are very old. I think the earliest grave in the Old Town Cemetery in Stirling dates back to the 16th century, which is really when you first start getting gravestones of a type we would recognise. So I would love to kind of wander around within that space and sort of poke my wee chubby kid fingers into the sockets of the stone skulls, or into the holes left by musket balls in the Holyrood Church there. And I would also, read the inscriptions on the stones. And it's definitely true to say that I learned to read in part by reading unfamiliar words, sounding out unto and remembrance and words like that on the stones. And I think also, in a way, began to foster an interest in writing too, from wandering around in there, because I think it develops your taste for character and narrative when you're in a graveyard.
That's a lovely way of putting it. You suggest quite early on in the book that Haphophiles like yourself are weirdos, to use your word, but you use it very much in a kind of an ownership of the term. Is there something liberating about attaching yourself to that label weirdo? Like, you can be whoever you want to be within that?
I think so. I mean, Jim Tipton, who founded the Find a Grave website, I think has described graveyards as parks for introverts. and I think it's true that it is a place that you can kind of come and feel in some way just accepted. And it's a sort of safe space in a sense. This graveyard here certainly is a place that sort of draws subcultures of all kinds. The Necropolis in Glasgow. Findlay Napier, the songwriter, has got an amazing song called Young Goths in the Necropolis, which I think speaks to the way that people will come here for a walk, or maybe for a drink, or, dare I say it, for a lover's tryst on occasion. And I definitely think that there is something about graveyards that sort of works on a kind of Venn diagram with a sort of outsider culture, or a feeling of outsiderdom.
I would like to ask, since we're in the Necropolis, there's something you talk about a bit in the book about graveyards can live and they can die. They can have a lifespan. Is the Necropolis a living graveyard, in your opinion?
Well, what I'm getting at there with that idea is that I think, in a way, in a sense, graveyards cease to be alive for the most part when they stop burying people in them. So I think I'm not sure that people can any longer be buried in the Necropolis. And I think when that happens, there is a way in which graveyards die, because they cease to have that very intense emotional relationship with grief and with death, and they become historical places in a way. But I wouldn't call the Necropolis a dead graveyard, because it is such a kind of public space, and it's part of the iconography of Glasgow, and it draws, as I say, youth tribes here and visitors of all sorts. And it's just a fantastically stimulating space as well. I mean, it's got absolutely the best view of Glasgow Cathedral is from the Necropolis. You can't see Glasgow Cathedral to its full effect unless you come in here. And also, it's full of stories. It's full of. I mean, the guy that wrote "Wee Willie Winkie," the little song, is buried just down the hill there. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I would never call this a dead graveyard because it's so popular and it's got a kind of active friends group and people love this place, so no.
So something that will be familiar, I think, to the audience is the little signs you see on graveyards everywhere around Scotland and indeed much further afield, little signs that say Commonwealth war graves. So I'd seen them, but hadn't realised the whole world of dedication and kind of culture that lies behind that. In your book, you really explore that. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, so the Commonwealth War Graves Commission is the organisation that's dedicated to maintaining these graves all around the world. So you will have seen them in graveyards. These are these kind of quite small white stones with the regimental badge of the person that's died on them and their name and their number and when they died. And there's 170,000 of these in Britain alone, and they're in every continent of the world apart from Antarctica. So they started to create these things during the First World War. There were so many people dying that they wanted to mark their deaths where they lay. There was a decision taken not to bring the bodies home, which is why there's so many of these British graves in Belgium, in France and so forth. The ones that you see in this country tend to be people who either died of their wounds on returning to Britain or died in training and such like in this country, or perhaps their ship went down and their bodies were washed ashore and they were laid to rest on the island where their body came to rest.
That's something that's incredible, like that thing where basically as near as possible to wherever the death occurred, they try and get them buried there. That takes these kind of war graves commissions to very unique and quite outlying places, which you explore in the book, eh?
Yeah, so in Scotland, you'll find these graves on little remote islands in the Hebrides, on mountain tops for air crashes, all that sort of thing. But the thing that I found incredible, the fact that I learned, which I think is astonishing, is that so many people died on the Western Front that every year they keep finding bodies. Even now, 100 or so years later after the event, they keep finding bodies and they bury them. They try to identify them first of all. They try to do that through DNA and so forth. But even if they can't identify them, they bury them in ceremonies with full military honours, as if they died yesterday. It's an incredibly moving thing. And in the book, I was lucky enough to be allowed to attend one of those ceremonies in Belgium. But then, astonishingly, on the way back from the ceremony in Belgium, in France, 2 more bodies were uncovered during road building, I think it was. And I was there for the moment when these were uncovered and identified as being Canadian troops. So no one had seen these bodies for more than 100 years. They had been lamented, they'd been grieved, people had wanted to stare upon those faces. Suddenly there they were.
That is a particularly striking, slightly horrific part of the book, because it is that some of the stories are very light and interesting down in the charnel houses of England where you have these medieval bones and things, and there's an element of kind of intellectual curiosity and fascination with all that. Mm-hmm. But it is that the emergence of all of the bodies from the First World War that are still in that clay, that are kind of coming back up. There's a very live part to this book. How did you negotiate the tone between, telling these quite light stories of, unknown bodies from a long time ago and these very fresh people that might still be grieved today?
Well, in terms of tone, it was important to me that that it wasn't a bleak or frightening book. It was always going to have sadnesses in it, and I didn't want to shy away from that. But I wanted it to be very much a book about life. This is a book about life, the life of cemeteries, the life of death, really, if you like. And also, more importantly than that, a book about love. Love is absolutely the central theme of this book. And what I mean by that is the love that people feel for people that they have lost, the love that a particular Muslim undertaker in London feels for the generations of community that he has served. The love that people feel just for the graveyards that are near their house and that they love to wander within. So I hope that I've managed to kind of manage the tone by that being the focus, that being the central theme.
So you did travel in Belgium around that kind of area, looking at the old theatre of war. What did you make of how they commemorate?
I mean, it's very attractive. It's very beautifully done, and there's a sense of peace and nobility and dignity in those graveyards, almost to the point where it makes me feel that it's shading into being slightly, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, a glorification of war. And I realise it absolutely is not intended to be that. Mm-hmm. I just think those are the unintended consequences of making those graveyards so beautiful. I kind of want, Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est to be carved across some of those stones, just to try to reflect the actual reality of the horror of those wars. But I wouldn't want it to be on my own great uncle's gravestone, if you like. I want kind of that sense of solace for myself, but I think a bit of realism for other people. So it's completely unfair of me to say that.
Your great uncle passed in
in the Second World War, but I think, I think they're almost too beautiful.
No, I can really. That is something that you bump up against, particularly in the chapters looking at war or looking at conflict commemoration, is that those places having such a close temporal link to the present, but also a kind of continuing political purpose. Yeah. You touch upon that in Ireland when you go to the Republican commemorations at Easter. Yeah. That seemed to be, so that section of the book looks at the commemorations of those that fought and died for the Republican cause, or were caught up in it in some way. And so they have parades. You describe the pageantry that goes on around Easter. There's kids dressed up as Easter Rising kind of heroes and that sort of thing. It's quite, it seems to be the part of the book with which you feel least comfortable. You slide quite easily into, the kind of London mosque. You slide quite easily around these different places, but you seem to feel least at ease with what you were seeing there. Could you tell us a bit about it?
I wouldn't quite say that I was uneasy or uncomfortable. I think it was more that it was just all so unfamiliar to me, and I was trying to find my footing in it. So I'd barely been in Northern Ireland before, and suddenly I was in West Belfast, and they were having this Easter Sunday parade along the Falls Road to Milltown Cemetery, to the Republican plot there, where many of those who have died in the IRA cause and other of those sorts of causes are buried and are remembered. So it was just very strange to see people who you're used to through the news being referred to as terrorists being celebrated and lamented. And what I was trying to do was to understand really what was going on there, and and also to understand the fact that it is very seductive. The whole idea of martyrdom, I think it's fair to say, is a really important recruiting sergeant in that cause, and has been for a very long time. So I wanted to write about the seductiveness of it, the seduction of it, without myself being seduced, but at the same time without feeling that I had to kind of come out and explicitly condemn what was being said. So I wanted to try to empathetically feel the real grief that people were feeling, because a lot of them were friends or related to these people, to your Bobby Sands and the Mairead O'Farrells and these people. I just wanted to try to explore it. So it was really just a case of me trying to find my footing there while I was actually watching the thing take place and while I was talking to people and asking them questions. But then when I came to write the thing up, to also try to find a sort of a midway point that didn't involve either glorification or condemnation.
I might have completely misread that section. It felt like that was the only part of the book where you could feel the audience watching you as you wrote. Maybe it's like because I studied about the Troubles at university and we always had to be so careful with our phrasing and everything. You are writing for a principally a UK audience, I think it's fair to say. Did you have that awareness of people in, like sort of English military towns reading this section about republicanism and having to mediate that with additional care?
I was aware of audience while I was writing that, certainly, but I wanted to be truthful to the situation above all else. And within the book as a whole, for instance, we talked about the Commonwealth War Graves chapter. There was material in there about British sacrifice in conflict. So I wanted to be careful in my use of language and so on. And it's a very, language in Northern Ireland is very fraught. Like, you know, the term paramilitary, which I would use very easily in Glasgow or in London, is a word that that people who are supportive of that cause would prefer you not to use. I think they would prefer to use the word volunteer. So just in terms of language itself is something you have to be very careful about. So I was very aware of that, but I hope I was just trying to be true to what I saw and what I felt, rather than being overly influenced by how the readers are going to react.
It was a really powerful section that I'm sure you'll find interesting and challenging in equal measure, hopefully, when it comes to read it. We were discussing how you've described this as a book about love. And that is something that comes through constantly and in so many different forms, in the kind of fractalised way that love is experienced. To stay in the island of Ireland for the moment, you explored a phenomenon that I'd been completely unaware of and felt very, very distant and very, very separate from, I suppose, my kind of East Coast Protestant idea of coping with death. And that was the Irish Killeen, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Could you tell us, first of all, what the Killeen were, and then I think you've got a reading for us.
Yeah. So Killeen is Irish for little church. And these are little graves in the landscape, unofficial graves in unconsecrated ground, where infants who were unbaptized were laid to rest for many centuries, until really quite recently. Some people say up until the 1980s, or even beyond, because the idea was if you hadn't been baptized, then you couldn't be laid in consecrated ground for fear of polluting the rest of that cemetery or churchyard. And
it seems very harsh, doesn't it? It seems like quite a tough measure.
It does feel very harsh. I think it's difficult for me as an outsider to kind of come along and judge that, but certainly speaking to people that were there, they did find it a very hard thing that they couldn't lay their child to rest in the churchyard beside the rest of the family or within the cemetery. So yeah, emotions definitely run high in this subject.
So within that, they had to negotiate a space that aligned their need to lay their unbaptized child to rest, or suicides as well, I believe.
Yeah, it was a wide range of people that you would find buried in the Killeen. So unbaptized children are the most well known, but also people who had taken their own life, mothers who had died in childbirth, murderers, various categories of people would be laid to rest in these places. And typically these would be graves in the countryside, near ruined churches, or particular sentinel trees, some landmark that would mean that you would know where your child had been laid to rest.
So I've asked you to get a little reading about the Killeens, just to give folk that a little additional insight into what is quite an unusual world for us, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. So I refer in this section to a woman called Tony Maguire, who is an archaeologist and anthropologist who's a specialist in Killeen burials. And I spent a day driving around County Antrim with her, talking about this and visiting Killeen sites. Tony Maguire, when we had earlier discussed the meaning and atmosphere of such places, had a much more positive take. Those scattered stones spoke, she felt, of a certain tender descent. If you take your baby and choose a really nice spot in the landscape that's important to you, that's taking control back from the church, she said. It's reassuring to me as an Irish woman that people stood up to them and were not prepared to accept, en masse, what their priest said. There's very much a defiance in that. She is an expert on the Killeen of County Antrim. For her master's thesis, she travelled around the region, armed with wellies and old maps and 19th century books, seeking Killeen and plotting them out. In this way, she identified almost 100. But she didn't just look, she listened. She spoke to gravediggers and the elderly, picking up stories like pebbles of quartz, following the light darkwards. As we drove over the high peatlands from Ballycastle to Cushendall, she recalled one of those conversations. "This," she said, "is where I saw the wee old man cutting turf." This would have been around 2005, and he was then in his 80s. She had pulled over to greet him, explained what she was about. They had spoken at first in generalities. Yes, he knew about Killiney. Yes, there were a lot around here. Soon, though, he began his own tale. He and his wife, in the early years of their marriage, lost a number of babies. They had their pick of Killiney, of course, but his wife worried that one day, when she was old, she would be unable to walk out to the moors and headlands to visit the children she had lost. What to do instead? Together, they made a plan. At the time of the first miscarriage, the man dug a grave at the back door of the farmhouse, straddling the entrance, one half in the hall, one half in the yard. He lined it with old stones that he had taken from a disused cemetery and laid the body inside. Then, Maguire recalled, they put a flagstone over the top so that every day when they walked out that door, they would remember them. They had a pact, the man and his wife. Whichever of them died first, the other would make sure that the remains of their children went into the grave with them. That way, when the other passed away, they would finally be all together. Now, I find that story moving, but also shivery and discomforting. It's the idea of having your dead so close, walking across the grave of your children every time you go out to peg some washing. There is, for me, a horror in that. Maguire nodded when I told her this, but couldn't agree. Sometimes, she said, it's about your point of view. As a woman, I can see how the mother would think, I've got them close with me. They're still here. I'm protecting them. When Maguire talks about Killiney, she does not do so in the dispassionate manner of a historian. Her strong emotional connection to these places is rooted, at least in part, in her own life experience. She and her husband have 2 adult children, but it was a long, hard road to get there. Before her successful pregnancies, she miscarried 3 children, including twins. So, she said, I have a real empathy with the babies and the mothers who lost them. I couldn't get past 18 to 20 weeks and I had nothing to bury. Then, here's these women who maybe went full term, had a baby, the baby dies, and it has to be buried in the middle of the night. At some point they must have seen or held that baby, and then it's gone. Sometimes I think, was this particular research laid at my door? Did I have to have that experience of miscarriage in order to take this on and relate to it? I feel these women and babies have nobody to speak for them, but I will bloody speak for them. If the souls of unbaptized infants didn't go to heaven, where did they go? The answer was limbo, specifically limbus infantum, the limbo of the infants, a place between heaven and hell. There is nothing in the Bible about this, but the concept developed over centuries of church thinking. For the families whose child died, this would mean suffering what Tony Maguire calls a double death. The child is lost to them, not only physically, but spiritually.
Thanks for that, Peter. It's a really such a fascinating insight, and that was going, we think, until the 1980s, anecdotally.
Yeah.
Burial obviously forms a tremendously useful part of human society, like human culture, our need to grieve, our need to process things, like literally process and emotionally process, and being tied to ritual. Less and less people are being buried. More cremations, more scatterings. You talk about that in your book. I think, is it the vast preponderance of Britons are cremated?
75%.
75%. Do you feel we're losing something by not having that real visceral interaction with the body, with the burial, with the proximity of the remains?
There is something about burial that is very real and can be very hands-on. I think it sort of depends how it's done. I don't think there's anything necessarily about burial that makes it a more a rich and real experience than cremation. I think it's really how it is done. There's a movement towards natural burial, which encourages people who are grieving to do such things as carry the coffin themselves to the grave, or perhaps even wash the body of the person that they've lost. And the idea there is that to really begin to understand your loss, it's better to be much more kind of hands-on and involved in the laying out and doing those final acts for the person that you love. And the idea there is that it's a way of beginning to process your grief, and it'll be a healthier thing for you in the long run. And certainly I spoke to people in the course of the book who had done that for their loved ones. And even that word loved one is a sort of euphemism that I don't even like. You know, it kind of gets in the way of the reality of the situation. People who have done those acts for their dead, and who have felt the better for it.
Yeah, I would, in my personal experience, certainly that. I used to live in the Republic of Georgia, and they're very much in favour of the entire village processes around the open coffin to process the loss of that kind of the member of the society. So whatever your relationship was, you have that moment of absolute reality. So I'd like to finish with, as soon as I started reading the book, as I knew I was doing this interview, and I was looking forward to asking you a question you asked just about Abdi in this book, which is, you always tiptoe up to, like, if you don't mind my asking, how do you want to be buried? Do you imagine your own tomb? Do you imagine, like, are you wanting kind of shoveled in the earth under Big Johnny Knox up there, or do you have somewhere picked out? Is it your local Cathcart back to Stirling? How will you meet the earth?
Well, the narcissist in me quite likes the idea of the Victorian style memorial with the weeping angels and that whole bit. The hippie in me is much more drawn to the idea of natural burial, being buried without a coffin, you know, without a grand headstone, just laid in the earth in a shroud on a desolate hillside somewhere and going back to nature. So I guess it probably depends, as I near the end of my life, whether it's the egomaniac or the eco-warrior who is winning out. You know, I hope the latter, and I kind of fear the former, I'm afraid.
Do you have a space? Does your family, have you spoke about it with your family in the course of this book?
Not really, no. I don't really like the idea that people should feel duty-bound to come and visit me. You know, I'm terrible for visiting relations that have died, and I wouldn't want my own children to kind of feel they had to come to a particular spot to remember their dad or whatever. So no, we haven't actually picked out a particular place, and I don't really want any kind of grand mausoleum or anything. You know, a Chucky stain will do me. Right,
but laid by the loved ones. I think we'll leave it there. Peter, thank you so much for coming down and meeting us at the Necropolis. The book is a real treat. It's available in all good bookshops. It's available in Porty Bookshop, I'm sure. Hardback, a mere snip at £20. You get absolute millions of stories and a journey to death and life and love and all that good stuff. Peter, thanks very much, and all the best with the book.
Thank you, Ali.